Ya Ali Madad, and welcome to the second session of our Thinking Ahead series. Tonight we'll be joined by Altaf Kassam and Salimah Dharsi, who will speak to us about the theme of economic resilience. So, to kick things off, it would be really useful to understand what you guys take the term resilience to mean. Perhaps we could start with you, Altaf.
Well, Yalimadat Alicia, Yalimadat Salima. Thanks for the question. I would say for me, resilience is about not being fragile. It's being able to be pushed around, to be pulled, to be moved in different directions, but not break. So that's for me what resilience is. It's the opposite of fragility. And resilience is like a muscle as well. Just like our muscles need exercise to become flexible, to get stronger, same with our bones. So resilience needs exercising. It doesn't just happen by accident or by evolution. You're not born resilient. You have to become resilient. And to become resilient, you need to take that exercise. You need to think about either in your education, your career, your business, what might go wrong and how it could go wrong, and try and work out how to get things in place so that you're protected when things do go wrong. Because we know things will always go wrong. And what we do know about crises is that they're always different from the last one. So you need to think creatively, imaginatively about what could go wrong in the future and how you can protect against it. So for example, you may want to make your business more resilient by diversifying. You may want to make your education more resilient by building on lifelong learning skills and so on. We can talk about that a bit later, but I think the main idea of resilience is being strong when change happens and being able to withstand that change.
I really like the concept of thinking about resilience as a muscle that we need to exercise. And that's something that kind of rings true with me and my own interpretation of it. Salimah, it would be really interesting to hear your views on what you think resilience means.
Ya Alimadat Alicia and Ya Alimadat Altaf. I couldn't agree more with what Altaf was saying. Resilience really means to anticipate change. So seeing potentially what could change in the future and acting now and putting things in place now that actually makes you withstand those changes and those challenges better. And we can't predict the future. Even in this crisis, no one really knows what the end outcome will be or how we'll get there, what the recovery will look like if we get that much of a recovery. Every day we're getting new data, new information on vaccine trials or on trade or employment. So our view of the future is changing constantly. But we do know that we are in a different landscape, we are in a different world. And instead of being pushed and pulled around by life and what it brings and being reactive, being resilient means actually today we should be a bit more proactive and see what potential changes lie ahead and how best we can prepare for them.
Thanks, Salimah. That's a really helpful way to think about it. And Altaf, if we can just take this theme of being more proactive, how might we apply that to our personal and professional education? And what could we do to build more resilience into those?
Yeah, well, I think in education, something that Hajra Mahmoud's long talked about, but which is now more important than ever, is this idea of lifelong learning. So lifelong learning means taking lots of different learning opportunities throughout your life. And now that can seem overwhelming, learning for your whole life. But honestly, what it really means, I think, is looking at all the opportunities that you have available and taking the best of them. And it doesn't just mean formal education. There's vocational education, so on-the-job education, internships, work placements. And there's charitable and volunteer opportunities as well. They're all things that you can learn from. And this is something that our community gives us a lot of avenues to pursue. So we're really lucky that we have a lot of opportunities for lifelong education, and we just need to take the best of them. So it also means thinking about transferable skills. So transferable skills are skills that you can apply in one place, but you can also pick up and move to other places. So they're not just for one type of job in one location, for example. If you change job or move geography, transferable skills can come with you, and that's what you're trying to get out of your lifelong learning. So for example, another buzzword is STEM. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and maths. But STEM skills are eminently transferable. They really work in lots of different fields. I met an English graduate the other day who's a volunteer like us, and he told me that 80% of his work now is looking at data. So the STEM skill of data science is something that even he, as an English graduate, uses in his daily work. So having STEM skills doesn't mean you have to have a STEM career, doesn't mean you have to have done a STEM degree, but these are transferable skills, like I said, like data science, like computer programming, that you can pick up and move with you to lots of different jobs. So even myself in the field of investments, I recently took a couple of courses in Python, a programming language, because I first learned to program 30 years ago and I needed to refresh my skills. And I think that's a good rule of thumb as well. I think those of us who need skills to keep earning should be refreshing those skills at least once a year. And learning is not just for earners. The rest of us should also keep trying to learn. Maybe say once every 3 years, try to learn something new, take up a new hobby or a pastime. But education resilience is really about lifelong learning.
Thanks, Altaf. And I guess you've touched on two really useful concepts there, which are transferable skills, but also making sure every few years we pause and think about new skills we might develop. Salimah, it would be good to have your thoughts on how we can build more resilience into our careers beyond kind of what Altaf said about transferable skills and new skills.
Sure. So one concept I wanted to mention here was something that Sheryl Sandberg wrote about in her book, Lean In, which I'm sure that many of you have read. And she talks about careers and career paths not being on a career ladder, but to think of them as more of a career climbing frame. She says that ladders are far too limited. You can only move up and down or on or off, whereas if you think of your career as a climbing frame, that you can move in many different directions, you can actually acquire new learning and new skills. And essentially, this will equip you with your own unique skill set, your own USP.
Yeah, and I'd just like to pick up from that, because what Salimah said about your own personal USP, we could think of as what's become a more common term now, which is portfolio careers. So I think even the most traditional employer would agree that the job for life is redundant. So the ladder, like Salimah described, is finished now. People have these climbing frame type careers, and you could call that a portfolio career as well. In a portfolio career, you can do lots of different things at the same time, or one after the other. They don't all have to be in the same field. Some could be charitable, some could be paid employment. But the idea is you keep adding strings to your bow. And by that, you make your career more resilient and you make yourself more employable. And a job for life might be what we used to have in the past. The portfolio career is increasingly what people have now. But I don't want to say that a portfolio career is for everyone. And definitely when you start in your career, it makes sense to focus, on the initial part of your career, lay those foundations. But soon you should start thinking about how you can broaden your skill set, taking those transferable skills again with you, and build up more resilience in your career so that if your industry changes, if you move in terms of geographical location, you can still take your skills with you. So try and think ahead, try and think about the future. Where will your industry be in 5 years' time? What skills do you need to develop to keep pace with it, and start building those skills now?
Thanks both for those really interesting observations and tips on resilience within our careers and also within our education more generally. It would be good now to turn to the economy and perhaps start with the big picture. Salimah, given you work in global markets, it would be great if you could share what you think the markets are telling us.
Sure, and some of you may be asking, why is this even relevant? Well, markets are really interesting because they're forward-looking. They essentially tell you what people think about the future of the economy and the future of businesses. So with this in mind, let's look at the US equity market. Yes, it's the S&P 500 index. At the peak of the crisis, back in March, this index was down 35% on the year. That's a bigger collapse than what we saw during the 2008 financial crash. But since then, actually, markets have rebounded, and the US equity market is now only down roughly 5% on the year. If you look at oil, which is a good barometer for global growth, that's rebounded some 80 to 90% from the lows. And if you look closer to home at the UK currency, the pound sterling, that's rebounded 12% from its lows to the value against the dollar. So the markets have actually been pricing in quite an optimistic outlook. So you could even argue, what's there to be so worried about? But the interesting thing is that if you dig a little bit deeper to what the headline numbers suggest, they're actually telling a far more interesting story. And that's that the future landscape of the global economy has changed and will continue to change. So for example, let's take the S&P 500 again. The rally that we've seen back to the highs has been primarily driven by technology stocks. So Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, all back to their all-time highs. Whereas if you look at hospitality stocks or airlines, they're still very much lagging the move. So already you're starting to see that some companies and some businesses are actually faring much better from this crisis than others. And you could also argue that, okay, we'll get another boost to global growth because economies are opening up again and we see pent-up demand coming back. But keep in mind, this also risks a second wave of the virus and then potentially a second lockdown and potentially another hit to global growth.
Thanks, Salimah. That's been a really interesting account of how the markets have been looking. And I think something that's coming through is obviously that there's different sectoral impact in different cases. I guess something that comes to mind here is that during the early days of the pandemic, COVID was described as potentially being a great leveler. I just wondered what you kind of thought of that idea.
Yeah, so I remember when this comment came out, and it was a very hotly debated comment that COVID-19 is a great leveler. And I think that over the course of the last 3 months, this has really proven to be so far from the truth. It's exposed so many inequalities in age, in gender, in ethnicity, in how governments can cope and react and have responded to the crisis, and how different businesses have reacted. And this, of course, all has an impact on people in the workforce. If you look at people that are able to work from home, they tend to be in higher paid jobs, whereas those who are in manual jobs don't have that option of working from home. And so arguably, they're at a higher risk of losing their job or going to work in a riskier environment. Now, if you take education, it's primarily been accessed through technology. So again, there's going to be inequality here because not everyone will have the same access to technology. And when I was doing some research for this discussion today, I actually came across a really interesting piece of analysis from the Sutton Trust that showed that children from private schools who are accessing online education every day is actually double of that from their counterparts from state schools. So all these factors are going to have a lasting impact on inequality going forwards. And I also just wanted to share with you some of my experience of working with focused humanitarian assistance. And that is, we're already starting to see some divergences come through in how this pandemic has affected members of the Jamaat, not just globally, but also much closer to home in our own UK jurisdiction across the various European countries.
Those are some really useful reflections, Salimah, particularly on how this crisis will affect different groups. And I think that's going to be a really key part of how we think about recovery and how we make things better, essentially, for lots of different groups of people. I think just thinking a bit more about the Jamaat, obviously we have lots of business people within the Jamaat, and I wondered, Altaf, if you could focus for a moment on what people can do to make their businesses more resilient.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. So I think the key to business resilience, like so many other things, is diversification. So diversification is something we talk about in businesses, but I talk to my clients about it in investments as well. And what it really means is spreading the risk, not putting all your eggs in one basket. So, you know, what we've seen over businesses over the last few years is that globalization has really pushed businesses to try and make their processes as efficient, as thin, as cost effective as possible. So using low cost producers, outsourced workforces in developing economies, and then trying to sell at the highest price, say, in developed markets. And that's worked because we've had global transport networks, low tariffs, easy regulation. All those things, I think, post-COVID are going to start falling apart, or at least being taken down. They're not going to work as well. And so businesses have to move to a more resilient mode. And it's a bit like what Salimah was talking about in the Sheryl Sandberg book about a climbing frame. We're going to have to move from a supply chain model, which is very long, very thin, and only as strong as its weakest link, to something more like a network, where you can have bits which fail, but you can still get up the network. You can still climb the climbing frame. And so you're going to have processes in place where if something fails, you have an alternative. So again, as we've both been saying, it's about thinking about what could go wrong, how it could go wrong, and building for the future. It's having to be imaginative about businesses. Now, some businesses operate on scale, so catering is a good example of that. If you own a fast food outlet, it makes sense to have multiple of the same brand so that you can have economies of scale in buying your goods, and then you can, marketing and so on becomes a lot more effective. So some businesses do operate on scale, but think about how you can diversify even within that business between, say, location, say high street versus shopping center, or delivery model from walk-ins through to online. The crisis has shown that you need to have that resilience so that you can actually survive when business conditions become tough. So for me, business resilience is all about diversification.
Thanks, Altaf. Obviously, diversification is really important in supply chains and in businesses. Thinking about kind of links of a slightly different sort, I guess maybe another factor are the kind of people-to-people or business-to-business links. And Maulana Hazri Imam, in his guidance in Lisbon during the Diamond Jubilee, mentioned that we should work together and come together. And I wondered if you had any practical tips on how we could do this more within the community.
Well, yeah, Alicia, I think we're really lucky again in what our community has to offer. And this time it's industry associations. So that's where, people who are working in the same industry can club together and make themselves more resilient. And they do that through, for example, knowledge sharing or purchasing power. But the idea is that by coming together, by forming or being part of these associations, we make ourselves all more stronger. We make ourselves all more resilient. And that's really important in terms of building the future success of our community as well. So these industry associations exist across multiple industries. If you're not sure if there is one for your industry, or you think there isn't one and you'd like to approach the EPB and build one, I'm sure they'd be very happy to hear from you. But the key is to work together to share resources, be it knowledge, be it purchasing power, be it advertising spend, and together make the community more resilient.
Thanks, Altaf. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that we're really lucky as a community to have so many resources and great forums in which we can discuss this kind of thing. I think now it would be useful to move to how we can build resilience into our personal financial situation. And Salim, I wondered whether you could offer us some tips on that.
Sure, of course. Well, the most simple asset we all can consider, be it individuals, families, or businesses, is that of cash, and how much we're actually putting aside during this period for an uncertain future. Arguably, at the moment, your cash is not really going to be working for you, with interest rates so low and likely to be low for a considerably long period of time. But this doesn't really mean we shouldn't save, because circumstances could very easily change through loss of income, be it through loss of salary or loss of business income. So we do need to be a bit more prudent about how we save. And I think what's interesting is that actually, if you look at savings rates during this crisis, they've actually gone up quite considerably. So for the month of April, US savings rates actually got to 33%, and that's over triple what it was any month last year. So if you look at the data, it is telling you that people are being more prudent. But this could also be a function of the fact that people aren't able to spend money because countries have been in lockdown and nothing's been open. So it's worth considering, as lockdown restrictions are lifted and the economy starts getting back to normal, how does that affect your spending habits in this new world? And I think it's something we all need to be quite mindful of, especially as government support is going to be unwound as well in the coming months.
Thanks, Salimah. I guess in one way, we've all been saving while the government's been spending. And Altaf, I wondered if you could offer some thoughts on what this means for the public purse and for our own purses.
Yeah, I think Salimah made a couple of great points. One is that interest rates across the world are going to stay very low for a very long time. And the other is that governments are pulling back on their support. So what does that mean? Well, it's great news for borrowers, and we'll come to that later. But if you're a saver, like Salimah said, putting your money in the bank seems like not such a great idea right now. But what I would say is that there's one type of saving that's really important for everyone, and that is saving for your pension. So this is a time now when governments, private sector providers have started pulling back on their pension guarantees. That really started happening after the global financial crisis, so more than 10 years ago. And it's not going to change. The governments aren't going to come back and start providing pensions and guarantees and safety nets like they had in the past. That world is gone. So it's up to us to look after our own retirement resilience. And to do that, we need to keep saving in our pension. However young you are, as you approach retirement, that's going to become more and more important as a source of future income. So think about saving for your pension if you haven't done that already. Even with rates so low, the beauty of compounding is that you can invest in, say, the equity markets, the bond markets. If you do it in a balanced way, you can grow that income all the way to your retirement. So pension savings become very important. At the same time, with rates so low, like I said, borrowing seems like a great idea. But we would be wary of people starting to borrow heavily against their businesses. Rates might be low, but financial conditions are still very fragile. We don't really know where the economy is going. And especially if you look at OECD forecasts, it's forecast that the UK will have a deep recession and a long recession. We've heard that from the Chancellor as well. Germany looks like it might come out a bit better, but still, with the uncertainty that's out there, we would definitely caution members of the Jamaat against using too much leverage against their businesses, has happened at the end of previous financial cycles, and be a lot more prudent about their borrowing. But saving for your pensions, that's something that everyone should do.
Thanks, Altaf. And that's actually a very good reminder for me to think about my own pension, which I've willfully ignored since I entered the workforce. Now it might be quite useful if you could kind of distill your one bit of advice on how people can maintain and kind of support their economic resilience in the future.
Well, I think it rests on the three blocks that we've talked about: education, career, business, thinking about diversifying. So that's very important, spreading the risk, making yourself more resilient through education in lifelong learning, through your career by building that, by using that climbing frame that Salimah talked about. Don't just think about the ladder, think about building laterally, think about a portfolio career. And in your business, again, diversification. Don't rely on a single supply chain, diversify, use a network, tap into these Smiley networks as well. And on the topic of lifelong learning, I should mention that as a Jamaat, we've all got access to online training provider Allison. All we need to do is log on to IOUK and click the link to Allison. So we've got a tremendous amount of resources. It's about, as we said from the very beginning, exercising that resilience muscle, thinking forward, thinking, say, 20 years forward. Now it's hard, especially when you're 20 years old, to think 20 years forward. So think, say, in 5-year steps. Where do you want to be in 5 years' time? What do you need to do to get there? What transferable skills do you need to pick up now to make sure that you do get there? And keep thinking like that. So transferable skills, diversification, thinking about the future, they help build up resilience.
Great. And Salimah, what would be your one bit of advice?
So I'll just keep it very simple. And that means more planning, means less panicking, and better decision making.
That sounds eminently sensible. Thank you both for those reflections. I guess it would be quite nice to end this conversation on a kind of positive note, even though, there is a bit of doom and gloom forecasted. So I think we now feel better equipped to get through that. I just wondered if either of you saw any opportunities arising as a result of this crisis. And perhaps Altaf, we could start with you first.
Well, I think one thing about the crisis is it has thrown into relief some of the things that are wrong with our society, that are wrong with the economy. And it does feel like people are more keen now to fix them than they were, say, 10 years ago. So, for example, the environment. People have stopped moving around. Air transport, car transport pretty much stopped for a couple of months. And we all saw the change in the environment. And that's something that I don't think is going away, this climate awareness, the idea that we need to act now to stop the world becoming a much worse place in terms of the environment. And we talk about in investment about ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance. I've talked about the environment part, but on the social part, that's really been brought into sharp relief, looking at things like income inequality that Salimah talked about, where the jaws of inequality have been widening for several decades, trying to bring them back together. And on the governance side, trying to make sure that companies are better managed so we don't have those questionable employment practices that a lot of the kind of success of some companies has been built on. So I think people are going to start looking at these things, and if they truly do address them, then I think could be a lot of positives that come out of this crisis.
That really rings true, Altaf. And actually, I think a lot of us have thought about what we actually really need at this time and what we think is important, in terms of both for our own selves and for our families and for the wider society we live in. Salimah, what do you think are some of the potential silver linings of this crisis?
So I think one reason we have to be optimistic about this crisis we find ourselves in is that quite often when we're hit by crises and we see a big shift in landscapes and the world as we know it, this quite often paves the way for innovation. And I came across this really inspiring story, and that was that Sir Isaac Newton actually discovered gravity during the Great Plague of 1666, when he was practicing social distancing and working from home. And over the last 3 months, all of us, in our own way, we've all had to adapt in some shape or form to this new environment that we find ourselves in, be it working from home or leaving our home to go and work on the front line or be an essential key worker, or homeschooling our children, or taking that extra little bit of care to look after the vulnerable people in your family, or embracing technology to keep in touch with loved ones. We've all had to adapt in some way, and it's inherently part of our human nature then to want to think of new solutions to overcome challenges and to find new ways of doing things. So this potential for more creativity and more innovation is something I think we can all be quite optimistic about. And I think that leads quite nicely to guidance from Maulana Hazri Imam, when he said to us that we can make the vehicles to go over those bumps in the road.
Thanks, Salimah. That's a really nice reminder of that bit of guidance. And actually, I think this brings our discussion to a close, so that's a nice positive note to end things on. Thank you both so much for your time. I think you've provided everybody with a lot of food for thought, and I certainly will be thinking about my own economic resilience and that of my family when we sit around the dinner table a bit later. I guess kind of what you pointed to shows that, just as we're able to adapt to this time, it's within our gift as human beings to think about the future and plan and prepare for that a bit better. And I think you've definitely inspired us to do that, particularly around this particular topic. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope everyone's enjoyed viewing at home. And Yali Madat.